I knew from the moment my hands disappeared into that river of blood that I was holding more than a woman's life. I was holding a dynasty, trembling and slippery between my fingers,
but she
like
isn't
a newborn's
responding.
first breath. The screams coming from Mistress Isabel
we are
Beaumont
losing them
could
both.
have cracked the rafters. They rose and fell in desperate waves, colliding with thunder that rolled across the Mississippi Delta like the anger of heaven itself. The birthing chamber smelled of iron and sweat and candle smoke. 18 hours of labor had turned the air into a kind of fever. Every time the mistress screamed, I saw the curtains tremble and the flames dance like spirits called to witness. "Push, mistress," I told her, my voice low and calm. "You got to give me all you got now. Don't you hold nothing back." She thrashed, her pale hair plastered to her forehead, her blue eyes glazed with terror. Blood streaked her thighs, and her breath came in short gasps, the kind that belong to women who stand on the border between life and death. I had seen death too many times not to know when he was near. He sat in the corner tonight, quiet and patient, waiting for his chance. But death was not the only power in this room. There was something else, something that hummed under my skin and warmed the glass vial hidden deep in my apron pocket. The master's voice thundered from the hallway. "Hagar, is she alive? Is my heir alive?" He hadn't dared step foot into the birthing chamber, where women's mysteries took place beyond his understanding. He hovered outside like a restless spirit, terrified of the blood and the screams that he himself had caused with his constant need for more heirs, more power, more flesh to carry his name. "She's alive, master," I called back, my tone steady. "But she's got a long road yet." His boots struck the floor in sharp, nervous rhythm. "Save her, Hagar," he barked. "Save her and my child, or by God I'll have your hide." He said it like a man who thought he owned God as well as me. I didn't answer. I just turned back to the woman who had made my life a living hell for 20 years. I had delivered her first child when I was barely 30. That baby had been stillborn, strangled by its own cord. I remembered the way Mistress Isabel had blamed me, screaming that I'd killed her baby on purpose, calling me a devil woman. Master Beaumont had whipped me bloody that night while she watched from the porch, still in her dressing gown, her face pale with grief but her eyes cold with satisfaction. I'd buried my pride with my blood in the dirt, and the next morning I'd gone right back to my duties. Because that's what we did. We kept breathing, we kept working, we endured. But tonight, endurance had a different meaning. I leaned close to the mistress's ear. "You're doing fine, ma'am," I said. "You just hold on a little longer." She sobbed, clutching the sheets. "Please, Hagar," she whispered. "Don't let me die. Don't let my baby die." Her voice cracked on the word please, and I thought of another time she'd said that word mocking me in her parlor 2 years earlier, when she sold my last child, Samuel. 14 years old, tall, bright-eyed, his hands always busy helping me mix herbs or gather clean rags. She'd sold him for the price of a Paris dress. "Please, mistress," I had begged that day. "He's all I have left." And she had laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "You're too old to worry about children," she'd said. "You belong to my bloodline now. That's your purpose." I had watched Samuel driven away in chains, his eyes wide with a fear he didn't dare voice. I never saw him again. That was the day something inside me cracked and the night this plan began to grow, patient as roots under the earth. The vial in my apron had been waiting for this night. It was small, filled with clear liquid, an herbal tincture of cotton root and Virginia snaker root, 2 plants that carried the power of life and the promise of its ending. My grandmother Casey had taught me how to mix them when I was a girl. "Some plants heal, some harm," she'd whispered, her wrinkled hands grinding roots in a clay bowl. "But the wise woman knows the truth, it's all in how you use them." Casey had come to America chained in the belly of a ship, stolen from her village on the Gold Coast when she was barely 16. She'd brought with her the knowledge of the old world, how to stop bleeding, how to start birth, how to save life, and how to end a bloodline quietly, without a trace. She'd passed that knowledge to my mother, who passed it to me, and tonight I would use it. "Water," I said to my assistant, a young woman named Mercy, whose hands trembled as she brought me the cup. The firelight showed fear in her eyes. She had never seen a white lady like this, hair wild, body slick with blood, teeth clenched around a scream that wouldn't stop. I took the cup and held it for a moment. The vial bumped against my palm through the fabric of my apron, warm, almost pulsing. Not yet, I thought. The child was crowning. The moment had to be perfect. "Push," I said, my voice firm. "One more time. He's right there, mistress. He's coming." She screamed again, a sound that tore through the storm and rattled every window in that cursed house. And then, all at once, there he was, a pale, slippery thing sliding into my hands, crying weakly but alive. The heir of Beaumont Plantation, born into a world built on the bones of mine. "It's a boy," I said flatly. The words tasted bitter. Mercy wiped the infant's mouth while I tied the cord and cut it. Outside, I heard the master's shout of triumph. "A son! My heir!" He didn't see the way I looked at that tiny face, so fragile, so innocent, yet already heir to 3,000 acres of suffering. I handed the baby to Mercy, then turned back to the mistress, whose body was convulsing with the afterpains. "Stay with me, mistress," I said softly. "The hard part's over now." Blood pooled beneath her hips. Her eyes fluttered. "Am I dying?" she asked weakly. "Not if I can help it." I reached into my apron. The vial was warm against my skin, the glass slick with condensation. I uncorked it silently, letting a few drops fall into the cup of water beside the bed. The liquid turned cloudy for a moment, then clear again like sin dissolving in holy water. I leaned close, my voice steady and kind. "You lost a lot of blood, ma'am. This tonic will stop the bleeding and help your body heal." She nodded, too exhausted to question. I held the cup to her lips, and she drank obediently, trusting me because I was the woman who had just saved her life. She would never know that I had also ended her future. When she finished, I set the empty cup aside and wiped her forehead. Outside, thunder rolled again, but it sounded different now, less like anger, more like laughter from the heavens. "Is she all right?" the master called from the hall. "She'll live," I said, "and so will your son." He muttered something about payment and heirlooms and God's favor. I barely heard him. I was watching the mistress's chest rise and fall, slow and steady, life returning, but something else was leaving her, a quiet closing of the door she didn't even know existed. As dawn crept over the horizon, I cleaned my tools, washed my hands, and looked out the window. The cotton fields stretched white and endless, shining under a thin layer of mist. The same fields that had stolen my children would one day choke on the roots of their own ruin. I glanced back at the bed where the mistress slept and whispered, "Rest easy, ma'am. You'll wake to a world unchanged." But everything has changed. The baby cried again, thin and high. I turned toward that sound and thought, heir to nothing. Outside, the first light of morning painted the sky blood red, and I knew I had just ended a dynasty. I was born on Beaumont Plantation the same way the morning dew was born on the fields quietly, without announcement, and gone before anyone thought to notice. My first breath was drawn beneath the same roof that would later echo with the screams of the women I served. I came into this world in a cabin made of rough-hewn pine boards behind the kitchen house, where the air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and rendered lard. My mother told me I was born during a thunderstorm, the kind that split the sky in two, as if heaven itself was trying to strike the delta clean of its sins. But the lightning never struck here. It always passed over us and hit somewhere else, as if even God was afraid to touch this place. My grandmother, Casey, was the one who caught me when I came. She was already ancient by the time I first remembered her skin dark and soft as river mud, hair silver as moonlight, eyes that could see into your soul. They said she had been stolen from the Gold Coast when she was barely 16, forced onto a ship where the air smelled of rot and misery, and brought to a world that had no name for her but slave. But she never lost her true name, the one whispered to her by her mother before she was torn from her village. Sometimes on quiet nights I'd hear her murmur it to herself in a language that tasted like smoke and honey. She'd close her eyes when she spoke it, as if those syllables could carry her home across the water. Grandmother was the first healer I ever knew. People came to her when the white doctor's medicines failed, when fever took the children, or the fieldsman broke his leg beneath a plough. She never charged for her cures, not because she didn't understand value, but because she said her power didn't belong to anyone who used coins. "Knowledge is the only wealth they can't steal," she used to tell me, pressing my small hand against her chest so I could feel her heartbeat. "They can chain your arms, child, but they can't chain what's in here." When I was 5, she started teaching me the names of the plants that grew wild around the swamps and ditches. She'd point to a sprig of green and say, "That one heals the belly." Another she'd crush between her fingers, its sap milky and bitter, and say, "That one'll stop a woman from bringing life into a world that don't deserve her child." I learned them all by heart. I learned how to grind them fine with a pestle, how to dry them in the sun till they crumbled to dust, how to mix them with water, honey, or whiskey, depending on whether you wanted to heal or harm. I didn't understand then how dangerous that knowledge was. I just knew that when grandmother's hands moved, people stopped dying. My mother, Ruth, worked in the kitchen of the big house. She was quiet, careful, with eyes always downcast. I think she learned early that silence could be a kind of armor. She didn't have grandmother's fire, but she had her patience. The Beaumonts thought of her as obedient, docile, the perfect house servant, but they never saw the small rebellions she carried in her apron pockets. A pinch of extra flour slipped to a starving field hand, a torn piece of her own shawl pressed into the palm of a weeping mother whose child had just been sold. My mother's defiance was invisible, the kind that left no scars and drew no whips. She used to tell me that survival was the truest form of resistance. By the time I was 12, grandmother had made me her apprentice. She took me along when she was called to the slave quarters to deliver babies. I remember the first birth I witnessed a woman named Dinah, barely 17, her face contorted with pain and terror as her body struggled to bring life into a world that had no mercy for it. Grandmother worked in silence, her hands sure and calm. The baby came out crying, slick and red, and she smiled for just a heartbeat before the overseer's voice thundered from outside, demanding to know if the property was intact. Grandmother whispered something in her old tongue, rubbed a bit of oil on the baby's forehead, and handed it to Dinah with the words, "May he live long enough to know freedom." That night, when we walked home through the fields, she stopped and turned to me. "You saw what we do?" she asked. "Yes, grandmother. We bring life into bondage," she said softly. "But don't forget, child, we can also end bondage by choosing when life don't need to come." I didn't understand her meaning then, but the words sank deep, waiting for the day they'd bloom into purpose. When I was 15, grandmother died. Fever took her quick 3 days from strong to gone. I sat by her bed the whole time, feeding her cool water and whispering the prayers she'd taught me. On the morning she passed, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "You're the last of us that remembers," she rasped. "Don't let them make you forget what your hands can do." Her fingers tightened once, then loosened, and that was it. The room went still, and the air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I washed her body myself, wrapped her in the quilt she'd made from scraps of old dresses, and buried her behind the cabin where the soil was soft and full of roots. After that, the other slaves started calling me Little Casey. The white folks just called me the girl who knows herbs. Either way, they needed me. I learned quickly that being needed was its own kind of protection. The Beaumonts didn't dare punish me too harshly, not when their wives relied on me to ease childbirth, and their children depended on me to survive the fevers that swept through the plantation each summer. I used that protection carefully. Never too bold, never too meek, just enough to keep breathing. By the time I turned 25, I'd become the plantation's midwife in truth. I delivered babies in the slave cabins and in the great bedrooms upstairs, moving between those two worlds like a ghost. I saw everything: the way the white women clutched their rosaries while I wiped their sweat, the way the enslaved women bit down on rags to keep from screaming too loud, knowing a sound might bring punishment later. Birth was the great equalizer. Pain didn't care about skin, but the aftermath always did. When a white child was born, bells rang in the big house, and whiskey flowed like water. When a slave child was born, the overseer just made a note in his ledger: new property added, $200 value. Sometimes the mother didn't even get time to rest before being sent back to the fields. I learned to swallow my anger the way I swallowed bitter herbs, quietly with purpose. The Beaumonts thought I was docile, dependable, but every time I caught a white baby and handed it to its crying mother, I thought about what grandmother had said, that we could choose when life should or shouldn't come. I never used that knowledge against them then. I was too young, too afraid, but I kept it close, like a knife hidden under my tongue. Years later, when they started selling my children one by one, that knife turned sharp. I thought of grandmother's voice, whispering from the earth beneath her grave. You can bring life, or you can end a line. The Beaumonts believed they owned everything on this land: the soil, the people, the very air we breathed. But they never understood that the power they feared most was already inside their walls, disguised as a midwife, carrying in her apron the knowledge to unmake their future. I was born on this land, raised by women who had learned to survive its cruelty, and shaped by the belief that someday knowledge would be our freedom. I didn't know then that freedom would come not by fleeing north, but by letting an empire die slowly from within one birth, one secret, one carefully measured vial at a time. There are screams that fade with time, and then there are the ones that stay inside you, coiled tight as a snake, waiting to strike whenever you close your eyes. The day Mistress Isabel Beaumont sold my first child was the day that kind of scream took up residence in my chest. It has never gone silent. The year was 1835, the spring air thick with the smell of magnolia and the hum of bees moving through the cotton blossoms. I remember it because the earth itself seemed too beautiful for what was about to happen. My boy Joshua was 10 years old, bright, quick, with hands that could fix a broken bucket and eyes that saw everything. He was the kind of child you believed might outrun the world if given half a chance. I was planting herbs behind the kitchen house when Mistress Isabel called for me. "Hagar," she said from the porch, her voice sweet as molasses and just as sticky. "Come here. We need to talk about Joshua." The way she said his name made my stomach turn. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked to the steps. She was wearing a pale blue gown that shimmered like dragonfly wings, her golden hair pinned in curls, her lips red from crushed berries. She looked like a painting, something too perfect to touch, too cruel to love. "He's getting too old to be underfoot," she said, fanning herself lazily. "Too old to be playing with the white children. It's time he learned his place." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Yes, ma'am. I've been teaching him his chores. He's a good worker now." She smiled, but it was the smile she gave before she broke something. "I've arranged for him to be sent to Louisiana, a sugar plantation near Baton Rouge. They're paying $300. That will cover the new piano I ordered from New Orleans. $300. The price of a child's laughter, the price of his life." I fell to my knees on those steps so fast my bones cracked. "Please, mistress," I begged, pressing my forehead to the wooden plank. "Please don't sell my boy. I'll work double. I'll sleep in the barn. I don't need food nor clothes. Just let him stay." She leaned forward slightly as if studying an insect. "Stand up, Hagar. You look pathetic down there." I stayed where I was. "Please," I whispered again. Her smile widened. "You people never learn. Begging don't change business. The buyer's already coming." And just like that, she turned away, humming a hymn about God's mercy while I knelt in the dust, choking on the taste of my own despair. The wagon arrived 2 days later. Joshua didn't cry. I had taught him not to. He stood beside me, thin shoulders straight, trying to be brave. When the overseer chained his small wrists, I felt my heart rip in two. "Look at me," I told him. "No matter what happens, you remember who you are. You're my boy. You hear me?" He nodded, his lips pressed tight. The driver snapped the reins and the wagon rolled away, taking my firstborn and the last bit of softness left in me. I stood there until the dust settled, then I went back to my herbs. The world had not stopped for my grief, so I learned to move inside it like a ghost. 2 years later, it was my daughter Rebecca, 12 years old, bright as sunlight, quick with her laughter, always humming while she helped me mix poultices. Mistress Isabel called her too pretty for her own good. I should have known what that meant. One morning in 1837, the mistress sat in the parlor with a man from New Orleans. I was dusting the mantel when I heard her say, she'd make good money in a house of refinement. The buyer runs a reputable establishment for gentlemen. Better she be there than tempting trouble here. I froze. I knew what those words meant, a brothel. My baby girl was being sold to men who would use her till there was nothing left to use. That night I went to Mistress Isabel's door, my knees already raw from begging so many times before. "Please, ma'am," I said quietly. "She's just a child. She ain't done nothing wrong." "She's too pretty," the mistress snapped. "You think I don't see how the men look at her? Better to make money off her than have sin under my roof." The next morning, Rebecca was gone. The wagon rolled out before sunrise, and I watched it disappear down the road, its wooden wheels singing the same dirge that had played for Joshua. I never saw her again, but I heard stories, whispers from other slaves who'd been to the city about young girls sold into those houses. I tried not to imagine what became of her, but some nights I'd wake up to the sound of a child crying and realize it was only me. Then came Marcus, 8 years old in 1840. He was the quiet one, always carrying a stick and pretending it was a horse. He had his father's eyes, big and gentle, and when he laughed, you could almost forget where you were. Mistress Isabel had taken up gambling by then, trips to Natchez, long evenings of cards and wine. When her debts caught up, she sold Marcus to cover them. "He's small but smart," she told the buyer, "a man whose breath smelled like whiskey and whose eyes never blinked. He'll learn quick." That was the first time I heard Marcus cry like a baby, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. I held him until they ripped him from my arms, his screams echoing across the yard. After that, I stopped begging. I stopped crying. Something inside me turned to stone. For years after Marcus, I moved through the world like a shadow. The mistress still called for me when someone was sick or pregnant. And I went, because that's what slaves do. We keep living so we can remember. But every time I held a newborn, I saw my children's faces in its features, and I wondered how a God could make so much life and allow so much death. By 1853, I was 50 years old and had only one child left, my youngest, Samuel. He was 14, tall for his age, clever with herbs, and the only reason I still woke each morning. I kept him close, training him to help with my midwifery so he'd be too useful to sell. I taught him how to read the shape of a leaf, how to listen to a woman's breathing to know when death was coming. He was a fast learner, and I let myself believe maybe the curse of the Beaumonts had passed me by. But hope is a fool's currency for slaves. One September morning, Mistress Isabel summoned me to the parlor. She was wearing a new silk dress, the color of fresh cream, and holding a letter. "Good news, Hagar," she said brightly. "I found a buyer for your boy. A cotton plantation in Alabama needs strong young hands. The price is excellent enough for a Paris hat to match my new dress." My legs gave out. I fell to the floor and pressed my forehead to her shoes. "Please, mistress, please." She laughed, a high, tinkling sound. "Get up. You're too old to be carrying on like that. Your time of breeding is over. Now you serve my bloodline, my legacy. That's your purpose." My purpose. The words hit me harder than any whip. That afternoon, they took Samuel away, his wrists in chains, his eyes searching for mine until the wagon turned the bend, and he was gone. I didn't scream, didn't cry. I just stood there, the sun burning my face, the sound of wheels grinding my heart to dust. That night, as I sat alone in my cabin, I remembered Grandmother Casey's voice. "Knowledge is power, child, and sometimes power is the only justice we ever get." For 20 years I had brought life into this world, white babies who would grow up to own black bodies, black babies who would grow up to be owned. But that night, something changed. I looked at my hands, these hands that had caught so many newborns, and saw what they really were, instruments of power. They could give life, yes, but they could also end a line of cruelty. As the moon rose over the cotton fields, I walked to my garden and dug beneath the roots of the cotton plants, pulling free the thick, twisting fibers my grandmother had once taught me about. Cotton root, bark, the root of the empire, and its undoing. I carried it inside, washed it clean, and set it to dry on my table. When it was ready, I would grind it fine, mix it with snake root and mint, and wait for the moment God delivered to me. I had lost 4 children to the Beaumonts. They had taken my blood, my tears, my heart. But the next time Mistress Isabel needed my hands, I would take something from her that no money could ever replace. That was the night I made my vow. The next child born under that roof would be her last. The night I had waited for all my life arrived, dressed in thunder and the smell of blood. October 15th, 1855. The Mississippi Delta was drowned in heat, even though autumn was meant to cool it. Storm clouds sat low and swollen, pressing the air so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Inside the great house, every candle had been lit, every servant summoned, and every prayer whispered toward a God who had never answered us before. Mistress Isabel Beaumont was in labor, and I was the only one who could deliver her child. For 18 hours, she had screamed through contractions that came like lightning strikes, each one splitting her body wider while her husband paced the hall outside, barking orders he was too frightened to carry out. The house smelled of sweat, candle wax, and desperation. Her sheets were crimson, her hair plastered to her head, her blue eyes glassy from pain and terror. I had seen women die like this too weak, too proud, too far gone to realize that bringing life could take their own. But I also knew what I carried in my pocket. The vial had been ready for months. I'd mixed its contents on a moonless night when the frogs were singing in the ditches and the stars refused to show their faces. I ground the cotton root until my hands ached, added Virginia snake root for potency, and steeped them together in clear water until it turned pale amber, like sunlight trapped in glass. It looked harmless, smelled of earth and spice, but it held the power to change the future. Every birth I'd attended since Samuel's sale had been practice for this moment. Every breath I'd taken was a step toward this room. I had already buried my children in my mind. Now it was time to bury her lineage in the only way I knew how, quietly, invisibly, permanently. "Push, mistress," I said, pressing a cloth to her forehead. My hands were steady. They always were. "He's almost here. You can do this." "I can't," she gasped, clawing at my wrist. "Hagar, I can't." "You can," I whispered. "And you will. The good Lord's watching." But I knew no Lord was watching us. If he had been, he would have stopped the whips, the chains, the selling of children. No, this was women's work, earthly, raw, and terrible. This was the domain of hands and blood, not heaven. Outside, thunder cracked. The house shuddered. A maid cried somewhere down the hall. Master Beaumont's voice cut through the chaos. "Hagar, save her. Save my heir, or I'll—" His threat was drowned out by another scream. The mistress arched her back, her fingers clawing at the air as if she could tear her pain apart. And then, with a rush of fluid and blood, the child came into the world, slippery and pale and crying. "It's a boy," I said. My voice didn't tremble, though my heart thudded in my chest. Mercy, my young assistant, handed me a clean cloth. "He's breathing," she said softly, relief flooding her face. "Good," I replied. "Wrap him up." I cut the cord, wiped the baby's mouth and placed him in Mercy's arms. The little thing wailed, weak but steady. The Beaumont heir, the child who would inherit an empire built on broken backs and blood-soaked cotton. I'd delivered hundreds of babies in my lifetime, but none felt heavier than this one. Behind me, Mistress Isabel slumped against the pillows, sobbing with exhaustion. Her skin gleamed with sweat. "Is he alive?" she whispered. "He's alive," I said. "You did fine, ma'am." Her tears of relief slid into her hairline. "Thank God," she murmured. I looked at her, at the woman who had smiled while my children were sold like livestock, and thought, yes, thank God indeed. The afterbirth came, as it always did, in a flood of red and trembling. I pressed a cloth between her legs to slow the bleeding, my hands moving with the precision of ritual. The other women began cleaning the linens, murmuring prayers. In the confusion, no one noticed me reach for my apron pocket. The glass was warm against my palm. My fingers knew the weight of it, as if they'd been born for this moment. "Mercy," I said quietly. "Fetch me some water." She hurried to the pitcher, poured a cup and handed it to me. I uncorked the vial beneath the cover of my body, tilting it so that the contents slipped soundlessly into the water. The mixture swirled once, clouded faintly, then went clear again. "Hold her up," I said. "She needs to drink this." Mercy slid an arm behind the mistress's shoulders. Isabel's eyes fluttered open, dazed and grateful. "What is it?" she asked weakly. "Something to stop the bleeding," I said. "It'll help your body heal." She didn't question me. Why would she? I had been her midwife for 20 years, the woman she trusted to save her life, the one she called faithful Hagar when guests were listening. I pressed the cup to her lips, and she drank every drop. For a moment, I thought I might faint from the sound of it, her swallowing, soft and trusting, sealing her fate with each sip. When the cup was empty, I set it aside, wiped her brow and smiled. "You'll rest easy now, mistress. The worst is over." She closed her eyes, murmuring, "Bless you, Hagar." "Bless you," I whispered back, "and may your blessings end tonight." Mercy didn't hear. The storm outside swallowed my words. The mistress fell asleep within minutes, her breathing even, her face peaceful. I watched her chest rise and fall, knowing the poison I'd given her wasn't meant to kill, but to take something more precious. It would work slowly, secretly, closing her womb with scars no doctor could see. She would recover, smile again, maybe even thank me for saving her. She would never conceive another child, and no man on this earth would ever know why. When the master entered at dawn, the air smelled of wet earth and blood. He froze in the doorway, his face pale. "Is she?" "She lives," I said. "And so does your son." He sagged against the wall in relief. "God bless you, Hagar." I nodded, keeping my eyes on the floor. "Yes, sir. God surely must have had a hand in it." He reached into his pocket and pressed a silver dollar into my palm. "For your trouble." I took it. The coin felt cold and heavy, like a promise. When he left, I turned to Mercy. The girl looked exhausted, her eyes red from sleeplessness. "Go rest," I told her. "I'll finish here." She hesitated. "What was in that tonic, Miss Hagar?" I looked her straight in the eye. "Herbs to heal. Nothing more." She nodded. Though I saw a flicker of curiosity she didn't dare voice. When she finally left, the room grew silent, except for the rain tapping the windows. I stood alone beside the sleeping mistress and the crying child, and felt something shift inside me, something that had been buried beneath grief for decades rising to the surface like a seed splitting open. Outside, the storm was breaking, the sky streaked with the first grey light of morning. I opened the window a crack, letting the damp air touch my face. Somewhere in the distance, the field hands were waking to another day of endless labor. Nothing in their world had changed, but I knew better. Everything had. I looked once more at the baby in Mercy's cradle. His tiny fists opened and closed as he slept, the future written in the fragile curve of his face. "You'll never have brothers," I whispered. "You'll never have sons." The words weren't a curse, they were a benediction. When I finally walked back to my cabin, the silver dollar still in my hand, the sun was rising red as a wound over the cotton fields. The world looked just as it always had, white blooms stretching to the horizon, the house shining proud and cruel on its hill, but I knew the roots beneath that soil were already dying. I had ended a bloodline before breakfast. Morning came slow, as if the sun itself feared to look upon what I'd done. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick and sweet with the smell of wet earth and magnolia. Dew clung to the cotton fields like pearls, scattered by an unseen hand. Inside my cabin, the first light slid across the table where I'd laid my tools the night before, cloths washed, blades cleaned, the wooden bowl still stained faintly red. I sat there a long while, staring at the streaks of dried blood on my knuckles. Mistress Isabel's blood. The blood of the woman who'd taken everything from me and now lay upstairs believing she'd been saved. I washed my hands again anyway, though the water turned pink each time. No amount of scrubbing could take away the feeling that the blood had soaked deeper than my skin. But it didn't frighten me. It steadied me. It reminded me that for the first time in 50 years, my life wasn't only about survival. It was about control. Through the thin walls of the cabin, I heard the plantation stirring to life, the rattle of harnesses, the bark of the overseer, the shuffle of bare feet heading toward the fields. The world outside hadn't changed, yet I knew something invisible had shifted beneath it. An empire had begun to rot from within, and no one but me could smell the decay. A soft knock came at my door. "Miss Hagar?" It was Mercy. Her young face appeared in the doorway, eyes swollen from lack of sleep. She clutched her shawl around her shoulders. "Mistress Isabel's asking for you," she said. "She says she wants to thank you for saving her life." I nodded, drying my hands on my apron. "Tell her I'll come soon." "Did she nurse the child yet?" Mercy shook her head. "The wet nurse from the quarters is with him now. Mistress too weak to hold him long." "Good," I said quietly. "She needs rest." Mercy lingered, her gaze flicking toward the table where the bowl and knife lay. "You sure she's going to be all right?" "She'll live," I answered, "but she'll never be the same." She frowned, as if she'd heard something beneath my words, but didn't understand it. When she finally turned to leave, I stopped her. "Mercy." She looked back. "What happened in that room last night stays between us. You understand?" Her chin dipped. "Yes, ma'am." "Midwifery is women's work," I said. "Men don't need to know what we do to keep life and death in balance. Some knowledge ain't for them." She hesitated, then nodded again and slipped away. When she was gone, I opened my small chest beside the bed. Inside lay the few things I owned that belonged only to me: a folded quilt, a Bible with no cover, and the silver dollar Master Beaumont had pressed into my hand at dawn. I turned the coin over in my palm. His gratitude glittered against my skin, a token of thanks from a man who would one day curse the very hands he'd paid. I dropped it back into the chest, let it sit among the ghosts. Before heading to the house, I stepped out into the yard. The morning light lay soft over the cabins, the smoke from breakfast fires curling into a pale sky. Children's voices drifted from the distance, thin, tired laughter before the day's labor began. My eyes caught on a patch of cottonroot blooming wild near the fence, its pale flowers nodding in the breeze. I knelt and touched the petals, wondering if they somehow knew what part of themselves had just changed history. By the time I reached the big house, the white servants were already bustling like ants. One ran for hot water, another for clean linens. The air inside smelled of lavender oil and sickness. Mistress Isabel's bedroom door stood open. She lay propped against pillows, her face pale but calm, the baby sleeping in a cradle beside her. When she saw me, she managed a weak smile. "Hagar," she whispered, "you saved me." "I did what needed doing, ma'am." She reached out a trembling hand. I hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her skin felt fragile, like paper left too long in the sun. "I owe you my life," she said. "And my son's." My mouth curved in something that might have been a smile. "Yes, ma'am, you owe me that." She didn't hear the double meaning. She only sighed, her eyes fluttering closed. "God bless you, Hagar, truly." I released her hand gently and looked down at the sleeping infant. His small chest rose and fell, his breath shallow but steady. A single curl of pale hair clung to his forehead. "He got your eyes," I said. "Then he's lucky," she murmured, drifting towards sleep. "Lucky." The word hung in the air like a joke only I could hear. The child would grow up surrounded by wealth and cruelty, but his bloodline would end with him. He was the last link in a chain that had bound generations of my people. I checked her pulse, adjusted the blanket, and turned to leave. At the doorway, Master Beaumont appeared, his face flushed from drink and sleeplessness. "How is she?" he demanded. "She's mending," I said. "The bleeding's stopped. She'll need rest." "And the boy?" "Healthy, far as I can tell." Relief sagged his shoulders. He stepped into the room, staring at his wife and child like a man seeing his salvation. "You've done the Beaumont name a great service," he said. "I reckon I have," I replied. He reached for his coat pocket and pulled out another coin. "You deserve more than thanks. You'll always have a place here, Hagar. My family's midwife. Always." The word felt like a chain slipping around my neck. I bowed my head. "Thank you, sir." After he left, I looked once more at the mistress sleeping soundly, her womb already sealing shut with scars no doctor would ever find. I felt the strangest sensation then, not triumph, not relief, but stillness, like the air just before a storm. I had expected rage to cool me or joy to lift me, but instead I felt peace, a quiet, patient peace that came from knowing justice had finally taken root, even if it would take years to bloom. Outside, the plantation gleamed under the morning sun. Field hands bent low, their backs silvered with sweat. The overseer's whip cracked like punctuation to their labor. Everything appeared exactly as it had yesterday, but I saw it differently now. The grand house on the hill no longer looked eternal. It looked hollow, fragile, waiting for time and fate to finish what I had begun. That evening, back in my cabin, I built a small fire and laid my grandmother's old mortar beside it. As the flames licked higher, I spoke softly to her spirit. "It's done, Grandma Casey. She'll never bear another. The line ends here." The fire popped, sending sparks toward the roof. I imagined she was answering me in the crackle, her voice rough and proud. "Power is the only justice we ever get, child." I crushed a handful of mint leaves between my fingers, breathing in their clean scent to wash away the night's memories. For 30 years I had brought life into this world with these hands. Tonight I realized they were also hands that could shape destiny. Later, when Mercy came to bring news that Mistress Isabel was eating broth and smiling again, I nodded. "Good," I said. "Keep her resting." "She said she wants you near when she gets strong again," Mercy added. "I'll be there," I replied. "I always am." After she left, I sat by the window watching the sky darken over the fields. The cicadas began their low, endless song. Somewhere far off, a whip cracked again. I should have felt despair at that sound, but instead, I felt a strange kind of calm. Empires, like people, don't die in an instant. They rot slow. They crumble one breath at a time, and I had just given this one its first fatal wound. I leaned back, letting the night wind carry the scent of rain through the open shutters. The silver dollar glimmered faintly on the table beside me. I picked it up, flipped it once, and let it fall. Heads. The master's face caught the candlelight, shining bright and foolish. "For saving your legacy," I whispered, "and ending it too." The candle flickered, the fields whispered, and I smiled into the darkness, knowing the world was already changing, though no one but me could yet hear it. Time has a way of softening most things, but not guilt, not secrets. They rot slow, like fruit left too long in the sun, and you can smell them even when no one dares name the stench. 5 years passed after that stormy night in 1855, and by the time the cicadas began singing again in the summer of '60, the Beaumont plantation had changed in ways no one could quite explain, but everyone could feel. The boy, Henry Beaumont, the long-awaited heir, was never strong. From the moment he drew his first breath, I knew he was too fragile for the world he'd inherit. His skin was always pale, thin as parchment, veins showing blue beneath it like rivers on a map. He coughed through most winters and sweated through every summer. He couldn't bear the Mississippi sun. It turned his cheeks red and made him faint. Mistress Isabel forbade him from playing with the field children, terrified their roughness would break him. He grew up inside that big house like a hothouse flower, pampered, pale and doomed. I watched him grow with a strange mix of pity and grim satisfaction. Each wheeze, each fever, each night of trembling reminded me of what I had done, of the justice that had taken root. The mistress doted on him endlessly, her whole world orbiting around his weak heart. She believed his frailty was God's test, that if she prayed enough, the Lord would make him strong. But prayers don't strengthen bones weakened by generations of sin. And God, as I'd long ago learned, had other ways of balancing the scales. By the 2nd year after his birth, Mistress Isabel began trying for another child. The master was eager, too boasting at supper about expanding his line, building his legacy. I was there, silent as always, refilling his wine while his wife blushed and smiled at his talk of sons to carry the Beaumont name. But months turned into seasons, and no child came. At first, she blamed her body's weakness after labor. Then she blamed stress, the weather, her diet. By the 3rd year, her smiles had turned brittle. The household grew quiet when she started speaking of it, how she felt the quickening. only to bleed days later, how she dreamed of cradles and tiny fingers that never came. She called for doctors from Vicksburg, Natchez, and even New Orleans. They examined her in hushed tones, scribbling notes while she cried softly behind her handkerchief. They found nothing wrong. "Your constitution is sound," one said kindly. "Perhaps the Lord simply wills that you rest." That answer did not satisfy her. After the third doctor left, she summoned me to her room. I found her sitting before her mirror, her hair unpinned, her reflection pale and wild-eyed. "Hagar," she said, her voice trembling, "you've been a midwife longer than these city men been breathing. Tell me the truth. Why can't I conceive?" My heart beat slow and steady. "The body's a mystery, Mistress. Sometimes it closes a door when the time for opening's gone." Her eyes snapped to mine, sharp as broken glass. "You mean I'm barren?" I hesitated just long enough for her to see the truth in my silence. She slapped me then hard enough to make my lip bleed. "Liar," she hissed. "You cursed me. You and your black magic. I should never have trusted you." I lowered my head, tasting copper and calm. "I only ever served you, ma'am." Her hand trembled. "Get out," she whispered. "Get out before I call my husband." I bowed, wiped the blood from my mouth and walked away, but her words stayed behind, festering. For weeks, she avoided me, refusing to eat food I prepared, refusing my medicines. She dismissed mercy too, claiming the girl looked at her wrong. But fear has a short memory, and desperation has none. Before the year was done, she called me back, this time weeping. "I was wrong, Hagar," she sobbed when I entered her room. "You're the only one who's ever helped me. Please, there must be something you can give me. A tonic, an herb, anything." There was something bitterly satisfying in seeing her beg, but pity, that old traitor, stirred in me too. Even the cruelest woman bleeds the same when sorrow comes for her. I set my jaw and shook my head. "There's herbs to bring life, Mistress," I said softly, "and herbs to end it. None can bring back what's been taken." She cried until her throat went hoarse. After that night, she never struck me again. The years crawled on, and with each one, the Beaumont fortune began to thin like worn cloth. The master grew heavier, slower, his once booming voice now slurred from drink. He took to his study at all hours. Papers and bills piled high around him. Cotton prices were falling, and talk of abolition was spreading like wildfire up north. But here in Mississippi, men like him still believed their world unbreakable. At supper, he'd roar about politics, about how the Yankees won't take what's ours. But there was a tremor in his hand when he lifted his glass, and I could smell fear on him like whiskey. The mistress would sit quiet beside him, her eyes hollow, her beauty faded. Henry would sit at the end of the table, thin arms folded, watching it all like a ghost. He never smiled, never laughed. His cough came back each winter, rattling through the house like the voice of judgment. Doctors came and went. Medicines failed. The mistress grew gaunt with worry. One evening in 1859, she called me to the nursery. Henry lay in bed, his skin pale as candle wax, his lips dry and cracked. "Do something," she pleaded. "Please, Hagar, save him." I laid my hand on the boy's forehead. Fever. I mixed a poultice from peppermint and feverfew, just as I had 1,000 times before, and laid it on his chest. His breathing eased for a while. He looked at me with half-open eyes and whispered, "Mama says I'm special. You think that's true?" I brushed his hair back. "Every child's special, Master Henry, but some are born to end things, not begin them." He frowned, too tired to ask what I meant. He lived, though weaker than before. The mistress thanked me through tears, clutching my hands, calling me an angel. I looked at her and thought how angels must look different depending on who's praying. By the next year, 1860, the whispers began. Neighbors noticed her absence from society gatherings. One woman said the Beaumont lady had been stricken with a curse. Another claimed the master had taken to visiting another woman's bed. I didn't believe that last part, though I knew his pride too well. He wanted heirs, not scandal. And every night, he lay beside a wife whose womb was as silent as the graves behind their house. When the war drums started sounding in the distance, their fear deepened. The mistress spent her nights praying at the chapel window, her candle burning till dawn. She looked thinner every week, her cheeks hollow, her voice sharp from sleeplessness. "Why has God forsaken me?" she'd whisper. I'd stand in the shadows watching her. Sometimes I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I'd remember the wagons, Joshua, Rebecca, Marcus, Samuel, and the pity turned to ash. One morning she found me in the garden, kneeling by my herbs. "Hagar," she said softly, "if I die without giving him another son, what will become of this house?" "It'll stand as long as it's meant to," I replied, not looking up. She knelt beside me, her white skirts brushing the dirt. "Tell me the truth," she said. "Did you do this to me?" I met her eyes then. "No, mistress," I said, letting each word fall slow. "You did this to yourself." She didn't speak again. She just stared at me for a long time, and in her silence I knew she finally understood. Not the how, but the why. That night, I saw her kneeling in the chapel again, whispering to a God who would never answer, and I smiled to myself, not with joy, but with the peace of a promise fulfilled. The Beaumont name would end in a whisper, not a roar. The heir lived, but the bloodline was dying. The roots of their empire had already turned to dust beneath their feet, and I was the only one who knew why the soil smelled so sweet. By the time 1861 rolled across Mississippi like a slow-burning fever, the air itself seemed to hum with dread. The men in the big house spoke in hushed tones about war, secession, and glory, while the enslaved whispered about freedom like it was a ghost story too dangerous to tell aloud. To the white men, the coming conflict was a matter of pride. To us, it was prophecy. And for me, Hagar, the midwife who had ended in a bloodline, it was opportunity. The Beaumont plantation still looked grand from the road, but up close it was fraying at the seams. Paint peeled from the columns. The fountain in the courtyard had gone dry. Mistress Isabel's garden, once her pride, had turned wild with weeds. The mistress herself had grown thin as a shadow, her golden hair streaked with grey, her once perfect hands trembling as she prayed each morning for another miracle child that would never come. And Henry, her precious heir, was a sickly 9-year-old, coughing blood into handkerchiefs embroidered with the family crest. The irony wasn't lost on me, the heir of an empire choking on his own lineage. Each time I saw him, I felt a mix of pity and grim satisfaction. He was innocent, yes, but his very existence was the punishment his parents had earned. By now, Mercy had become more than my assistant. She was my confidant. She was 28 then, strong in body and sharp in mind. Her little boy, Thomas, was nearly 5, a bright, curious child with quick hands and quicker eyes. I saw in her the same fire I once had, when my children were still mine to hold. Mercy worked beside me every day, helping deliver babies, grind herbs, and tend to the sick. But there was a question lingering between us, one she had never dared to speak until that spring. It was a warm evening, the sky glowing pink above the cypress trees. We were sitting behind my cabin drying herbs on racks when she finally said it. "Miss Hagar," she began softly, "the tonic you gave Mistress Isabel that night, what was really in it?" My hands stilled. I didn't look at her right away. "You know what it was," I said. "Medicine to stop the bleeding." Mercy shook her head. "I know cottonroot when I smell it. My grandmother used to say it stops more than bleeding, said it can stop the seed from taking root." For a moment I forgot to breathe. The night sounds filled the silence, the chirp of crickets, the low hum of the delta. She had said it plain. She knew. "Where'd you hear that?" I asked. "She told me stories," Mercy said quietly, "about women back on the islands who knew how to decide when life should come and when it shouldn't. Said that knowledge traveled in the blood of women like us." She looked straight at me then. "You used it, didn't you? On her?" I met her gaze. Her eyes didn't hold judgment, only awe, and something like understanding. "You don't know what you're asking," I said finally. "I know exactly what I'm asking," she replied. "If a woman can use what she knows to protect herself, to protect her children, then that's power. And I need power, Miss Hagar. I need to know how to fight back." The truth of her words settled between us like smoke. I saw Samuel in her eyes, my youngest son, sold for a dress and a hat. I saw all my children's faces, fading with time but never gone. "Come by tomorrow night," I said, finally. "Bring a jar and a quiet tongue." That was the beginning of the thing that changed both our lives. Under the cover of darkness, I began teaching Mercy what my grandmother Casey had taught me: how to grind roots to powder, how to read the moon's light on the leaves, how to tell when an herb could save and when it could destroy. I taught her the language of the earth, the one that spoke through scent and touch, through the pulse of sap and soil. She learned fast, faster than I expected. But our lessons were not just about herbs, they were about survival. I told her about Moses, a freedman living near Vicksburg who ran a safe house for runaways. He was part of a hidden network that stretched like veins beneath the country roots carved by courage, connecting plantations to freedom in the north. We called it the Underground River. It wasn't a river of water, but of people, moving silently through the night. Mercy's eyes lit up with a hope I hadn't seen in years. "You know them?" she whispered. "I do," I said. "And one day, if the time comes, they'll know you too." From then on, I began making trips to nearby plantations under the guise of midwifery work. In truth, I was gathering information, passing coded messages through trusted hands. We used herbs as signals, bundles of mint for safety, sage for danger, dried lavender tied with black string for ready to move. It was risky, but after a lifetime of quiet servitude, I had grown bold. Meanwhile, inside the big house, the mistress grew stranger by the day. She had taken to locking herself in her room for hours, praying aloud, her voice rising and falling like the wind through the trees. Once I heard her whispering my name in those prayers, and I knew somewhere deep in her madness she suspected me. One evening she called me upstairs. The air in her room was thick with candle smoke. On the table lay a Bible, its pages marked with trembling fingers. "Hagar," she said, her voice shaking. "I had a dream last night. There was a serpent in my bed. It whispered that my womb was cursed. You did this to me, didn't you?" Her words should have frightened me, but they didn't. I had spent too long fearing her. "Mistress," I said softly, "the only curse on this house was made by your own cruelty." Her face twisted, and for a heartbeat I thought she'd strike me, but then her shoulders slumped. She sank into her chair, sobbing. "Then God help me," she whispered. "God help us all." He wouldn't, not the way she wanted. That same summer, Master Beaumont began sending men to join the Confederate ranks. He grew desperate for funds, mortgaging land and selling slaves to pay his debts. Rumors spread that he'd lost half his fortune on failed shipments. The fields grew wild, untended. The overseers grew crueler. In the shadows of all that ruin, my plan with Mercy ripened. She had decided she couldn't wait any longer. Thomas, her boy, was nearly 6, strong enough to run, smart enough to stay silent. "They'll sell him soon," she told me one night, her voice tight. I heard Master talking to the overseer, said he'd fetch a good price. I felt something old and burning rise inside me. "Then it's time," I said. We worked in silence that night. I packed her a small pouch of herbs for sickness, a loaf of bread, and a letter to Moses written in my careful hidden script. "You'll follow the river north," I told her. "There's a man with a scar on his cheek waiting at the crossing past Vicksburg. His name's Moses. Say the midwife sent me. He'll know." Tears filled her eyes. "What about you?" "I'll stay," I said. "Someone has to keep the fire lit." When she and Thomas slipped into the darkness 2 nights later, the air felt electric, alive. I watched from my doorway as they disappeared among the cypress trees, swallowed by the humid night. For the first time in years, I felt something close to peace. That night, I whispered to my grandmother's spirit, "It's beginning again." The underground river was moving, carrying with it the seeds of a new world. And though my body would never know freedom, our knowledge was already on its way north, carried in the hearts of those brave enough to flee. By 1862, the Beaumont plantation had begun to unravel like an old quilt. The grand columns still stood, the gates still gleamed with their iron curls, but everything in between had started to rot. Paint peeled from the shutters, rats nested in the grain stores. The fields lay half-picked, choked with weeds that grew as fast as the overseer's temper. And over it all hung the constant, distant thunder of war, a low, rumbling sound that rolled across the Mississippi Delta like the promise of a storm that would never end. The white men called it the war between the states. We called it God's reckoning. By then, word had spread that Lincoln's army was moving south. Union gunboats patrolled the river, and escaped slaves whispered through the night like shadows, slipping toward freedom, while the Beaumonts clung to the ruins of their old world. I saw it happening long before they did the slow death of everything they'd built on blood and cotton. Mistress Isabel had lost her reason long before the first cannon fired. Her obsession with bearing another child had turned her mind brittle. She ate little, slept less, and spent her days staring out the window of her upstairs room, as if waiting for something she could no longer name. Her once bright hair had gone dull, streaked with silver, and her hands, those soft hands that had once struck me without hesitation, now trembled even when they held a spoon. Sometimes she'd send for me in the middle of the night. I'd climb the stairs to find her pacing the floor, the candlelight catching her wild eyes. "Hagar," she'd whisper, clutching her rosary so tight her knuckles turned white. "It's your fault, isn't it? You did something to me. I know it. The doctors can't see it, but you—" I'd bow my head. "Mistress, I did only what was needed to save your life." "Save my life?" she'd cry. "You stole it. You stole my womanhood, my purpose." Her voice would crack on that last word, breaking into sobs that echoed down the hall. I'd stand there, silent, letting her rage pass like summer thunder. There was nothing she could do to me now. She was trapped inside her own despair, and every tear she shed watered the seeds of the justice I'd planted years ago. The master, meanwhile, was drowning in debts and whiskey. His once booming voice had gone hoarse from shouting at men who no longer feared him. His cotton lay unsold, his creditors knocking louder each month. When war broke out, he sent half his able-bodied slaves to dig trenches for the Confederacy, promising the overseer that the South will rise again. But even he must have felt the tremors of the world shifting under his feet. He could smell his empire dying. Henry, their precious heir, was 7, now thin, pale, and sickly as ever. His cough rattled through the house like the tolling of a bell. Mistress Isabel kept him wrapped in blankets, even in the summer heat, terrified that a breeze might kill him. "He's the future," she'd whisper. "He must be protected." From what, she never said. I watched it all unfold quietly, my heart split between grim satisfaction and a kind of weary sorrow. Revenge had a sweetness to it, but it was a bitter kind, like honey left too long in smoke. I had ended their bloodline, yes, but I hadn't expected to live long enough to see how slowly that ending would come. Then came the news that Vicksburg had fallen under Union siege. The sky seemed to darken that day, though the sun burned bright. Rumors swept through the quarters Union, soldiers freeing the enslaved, planters fleeing their homes. The white folks at Beaumont pretended not to hear, but fear leaked from them like sweat. The master began sleeping with a pistol on his desk. Mistress Isabel doubled her prayers. That same week, a rider arrived with a letter sealed in grey wax. The master tore it open at supper, his hands shaking. I watched from the doorway as his face turned the color of ash. "The banks are calling in the loans," he muttered. "They'll take the land if we can't pay." Mistress Isabel gasped. "But this land, this is our family's legacy." "Legacy don't pay debts," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "We're finished." I remember the silence that followed, broken only by Henry's soft cough. The mistress's eyes darted toward me, and for the first time I saw something like hatred mixed with fear. She still suspected what I'd done. And now, stripped of wealth and pride, that suspicion festered into obsession. Days later, she began following me through the halls. If I went to the garden, she appeared by the fence. If I walked to the kitchens, I felt her gaze from the balcony. Once, she even entered my cabin uninvited. I came back from tending a fevered child, to find her standing by my shelf of jars, her hands trembling as she held one up to the light. "What's in this?" she demanded. "Chamomile," I said evenly. "For sleep." She uncorked it and sniffed. Liar. Her hand shook so badly she nearly spilled the contents. I took the jar gently from her and set it down. "You should be resting, mistress." She glared at me, her lips trembling. "You think I don't know what you are? You think I don't know the power you hold? You cursed me." I stepped close enough for her to see the calm in my eyes. "I didn't curse you," I said softly. I freed myself. For a heartbeat, her rage faltered. She blinked, the words sinking in. Then she turned and fled the cabin, skirts dragging through the dirt. After that, she stopped calling for me, but her paranoia deepened. The house servants whispered that she'd started talking to herself, that she saw shadows moving when no one was there. Once, she was found in the chapel tearing pages from her Bible, muttering that the midwife's hands were red with sin. The war drew closer. Cannon fire echoed across the river some nights, distant but steady. Refugees passed through the delta, men limping, women carrying children, the air thick with smoke and rumor. And still, the Beaumonts clung to their crumbling estate, like ghosts unwilling to leave the earth. Then, in late 1863, everything began to collapse at once. The overseer deserted, taking a dozen slaves with him. The fields burned after a lightning storm, destroying what little crop remained. And Henry fell ill again, this time worse than before. Mistress Isabel sent for every doctor she could find, but most had gone to the war. Only one old man from Natchez came, shaking his head before he even entered the room. "This child's lungs are failing," he said. "There's nothing to be done." She turned to me, her eyes wild. "You saved me once," she pleaded. "Save him." I looked at the boy, his frail chest heaving, his breath a whisper. I thought of all the children she had sold, all the mothers who had begged her for mercy, and I said, "I will do what I can." That night, I brewed a tea of willow bark and honey to ease his pain. He drank it and slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. When dawn came, he was still. Mistress Isabel's scream shook the house. She fell to her knees beside his body, clutching him so tight her nails left marks on his skin. "You did this!" she shrieked at me. "You killed him!" "No, mistress," I said. "You did." She collapsed then, sobbing until her voice gave out. By sundown, she had locked herself in her room. She stayed there for days, refusing food, refusing prayer. The master roamed the house like a man already half dead, staring at the walls as if he could see his ancestors laughing at him. And I, Hagar, watched it all. The end I had set in motion finally taking shape. The Beaumont dynasty was dying not by sword or fire, but by its own hand. The war was still raging beyond our fields, but here, in the heart of Mississippi, justice had already come home. The morning the Union soldiers rode through the Beaumont gates, the world smelled different, like iron and rain and endings. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder from battles miles away, but to me it smelled like freedom. I was standing in the garden, hands deep in the black soil, when the first blue coats appeared down the road, their flags snapping in the humid air. The war had finally reached us, and with it came the death of everything that had ruled my life. The master stumbled out onto the veranda, half drunk, shouting for the soldiers to turn back. His voice cracked like old wood. "This is private property," he screamed. "You've no right here." The officer leading the column dismounted slowly, his face unreadable beneath his dusty hat. "Sir," he said evenly, "by order of the United States Army, this plantation and all persons upon it are now under federal protection." It took a heartbeat for the words to settle. Then I heard them ripple through the fields like thunder through tall grass free. The word didn't need to be spoken aloud. We felt it. The master collapsed into a chair, his face gray with disbelief. "You can't take what's mine," he whispered. But everything had already been taken. The land was dying, his fortune gone, his heir buried in the ground behind the house. All that remained was the hollow shell of a man who had spent his life owning others and never learned how to own himself. Mistress Isabel didn't come outside that day. She stayed in her room, the curtains drawn, clutching at the last photograph of her son until the edges crumbled between her fingers. Her beauty had vanished, eaten away by grief and madness. Sometimes I wondered if she even knew the war was over. Her war had ended long before, on the day her womb went silent. The Union men set up camp by the stables. They handed out papers, freedom papers. They called them to those of us who had once been listed as property. I signed my name slowly, the letters shaking from years of secrecy, and for the first time in my life, the act of writing felt holy. That night, I sat outside my cabin and watched the sky burn orange over the delta. For the first time, there were no overseers shouting, no chains clanking, no sound but the chirping of crickets and the quiet laughter of people tasting freedom. Children danced barefoot in the dirt. Old men wept without shame. The air itself felt lighter, as if the land had been holding its breath for centuries and was finally exhaling. But for me, freedom came with the weight of memory. Every joy carried a shadow. Every whisper of liberty carried the echo of my children's cries. Joshua at 10, Rebecca at 12, Marcus at 8, Samuel at 14. Their names beat against my ribs like wings. I wanted to believe they saw me now, that they knew their mother had kept her promise. A week after the soldiers arrived, Mistress Isabel took her own life. They found her in her bedroom, an empty bottle of laudanum on the floor, her lips stained white. The master died a few months later. His heart gave out during an argument with a banker, come to seize what was left of the property. I didn't attend their burials. I didn't need to. Their deaths were only the final punctuation to a story that had ended years before. When the Beaumont plantation was auctioned, I was there not as a servant, but as a witness. I stood among freedmen who bid on parcels of the land they had once worked for nothing. The big house sold last. Its marble steps, its grand parlor, its chandeliers all went for less than the price of a single good harvest. I watched strangers walk through its halls and felt no sorrow, only closure. I used the coins I'd saved over decades to buy a small patch of soil near Vicksburg, the same land where Moses had once hidden runaways. I built a cabin with my own hands and planted herbs in neat rows, cottonroot, mint, ginger, snakeroot. The earth took to me like it remembered my touch. Before long, women came from miles around for my help, freed women, widows, mothers. They called me Aunt Hagar, the midwife who could bring life safely into a world that had nearly forgotten Mercy. Sometimes I thought about Mercy and her boy Thomas. I hadn't heard from them in years, but one afternoon a letter came from a place called Toronto. It was written in careful, practiced handwriting. "Dear Miss Hagar, Mama asked me to tell you she's alive and well. She says to thank you for the road you showed her. I'm teaching at a school for colored children. Mama's hair has gone gray, but she still smiles the way I remember. She said you'd know what that means." I did. I folded the letter and placed it beside my grandmother's old mortar. That night, I lit a candle and whispered thanks to the women who had come before me, to Casey, who brought the knowledge across the ocean, to Mercy, who carried it north, and to every nameless mother who had survived long enough to pass it on. Years rolled by. Reconstruction came and went, leaving behind its own kind of ruin. The world changed, but not as quickly as the speeches promised. There were new laws, new flags, new names for the same old hate. Yet even through it all, I kept working, delivering babies, tending to the sick, teaching younger women the craft that had been our quiet weapon for centuries. People began calling me the healer of the Delta. They said my hands could pull a soul back from death. But I knew better. My hands had once ended a dynasty. Now they worked to rebuild what that dynasty had destroyed. Sometimes at dusk I walked past what was left of the Beaumont estate. The big house stood empty, its roof sagging, its walls scarred by vines. The windows were black hollows, like eyes long since closed. The fields had been divided among freedmen farmers. Children played where overseers once cracked their whips. Every rustle of the wind through the magnolias sounded like laughter, the laughter of the dead finally at peace. By 1882, my hair had turned the color of ash. My hands shook when I mixed herbs, but my mind stayed clear. I began writing down my story not for fame, but so the truth wouldn't die with me. I wrote by candlelight, the letters crooked but steady, my words a confession and a hymn. I wrote of blood and birth, of herbs and vengeance, of how our knowledge had been the only weapon the world had left us. I wrote of Mistress Isabel's screams and Samuel's quiet courage, of the night I held and a vial that could end a dynasty and chose justice over mercy. Some nights when the candle burned low, I thought I heard my grandmother's voice in the wind. Knowledge is power, child. Power is justice. And I'd whisper back, the justice is done. When my time finally came that December, I wasn't afraid. I lay down in my bed, the quilt I'd sewn from scraps of old slave garments pulled over me, and closed my eyes. I could hear the children outside laughing in the fields. Free children, children who would never know chains. They buried me under a willow near my garden. No marble, no scripture, just a wooden cross carved with one word, Hagar. Years later, they say, when the wind blows through the delta, you can still smell herbs in the air, cotton root and snake root, mingling with magnolia. Some folks claim they hear the faint sound of a woman's voice humming a cradle song, low and sweet, carrying across the fields where once only suffering lived. But it isn't a ghost that sings. It's memory. It's justice. It's the echo of every woman who learned that even the smallest act, one drop of tincture, one whispered secret can change the world. The Beaumont name is gone now, swallowed by the river and the years. But the knowledge remains, flowing like an underground current, quiet and unstoppable. And somewhere, beneath the soil of Mississippi, my grandmother's words still bloom. Knowledge is power, and power is the only justice the oppressed will ever truly own.